Hello, welcome to our discussion on the topic of invasive species. By the end of today's talk, you will be familiar with what invasive species are, why they are problematic, and how they spread. My name is Shika Singh, and I'll be your lecturer for this talk. I am the Invasive Species Coordinator for the JLW SISMA, which stands for Jackson, Lenawee, Washtenaw Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. Before we get to what invasive species are, I would like to ask you a question. If someone asked you to describe Michigan to them, what pops into your mind? The first thing that pops into my mind is beautiful natural resources, parks, rivers, streams, places to canoe, fish, and hunt. As our state motto says, pure Michigan. If you spend time outside, you've probably seen a variety of species like turtles, deer, songbirds, and crayfish. The previous slide showed a variety of species you've probably seen many times as you've been out and about in Michigan. However, there are other species that are either not well known or you don't see them at all. And that could be because of a few reasons. One, their habitat is really restricted and people don't generally venture out there, or because they are endangered or threatened. In this slide, we show a couple examples. The first one being Mitchell's satyr, which is an endangered butterfly. This butterfly is restricted to rare wetlands called fens, which are low nutrient systems that receive carbonate-rich groundwater from seeps and springs. Next to it is Heinz emerald dragonfly. This is interesting because the adults lay their eggs in small streams and fens and sedge meadows. And after hatching, the aquatic larvae spend up to 5 years in wetlands before completely maturing and emerging as adult dragonflies. Pitcher's thistle is native to sand dune shorelines along the upper Great Lakes and is considered threatened. It's considered threatened mainly due to shoreline development, road maintenance and construction, and shoreline recreational activities. The piping plover is an endangered shorebird, and they only have about 75 to 80 nesting pairs in the entire Great Lakes region. The Massasauga rattlesnake is found near wet prairies, marshes, low-lying rivers, and is listed as threatened. I know that this species kind of makes people a little nervous about walking around these habitats. However, they are shy and they try to avoid people. Rattlesnakes and snakes in general are really important because they provide pest control. And finally, the Kirtland warbler. It's a rare bird that resides in Michigan's jack pine forests. It's dependent upon fire to provide the small trees and open areas that meet its rigid habitat requirements for nesting. This is actually considered a conservation success story, as in the 1970s, there are only 207 breeding pairs, and currently we have about 2,300 breeding pairs. Michigan also has a diverse landscape. We have about 35,000 inland lakes, 49,000 miles of rivers, and currently Michigan is home to over 20 million acres of forest land. The United States Department of Agriculture and Forest Service identified more than 50 forest types in Michigan. Only 23 of those forest types occupy more than 1% of the total forest area. We also have an international wildlife refuge with Canada. The refuge consists of 48 miles of Detroit River, including 6,000 acres of islands, coastal wetlands, marshes, and shoals. Michigan has a variety of unique species of animals and critical habitat worth protecting. However, that biodiversity is being threatened. The term biodiversity is derived from the word bio, meaning living, and diversity meaning variety. Hence, biodiversity is a number of different plants and animals in an area. As you can see in this map, biodiversity tends to increase as you approach the equator. On a global basis, the two great destroyers of biodiversity are habitat destruction and invasion by exotic species. An invasive species is one that is not native and whose introduction causes harm or is likely to cause harm to Michigan's economy, environment, or to human health. Invasive species won't necessarily be limited by the same constraints as native species, such as temperature, soil characteristics, and elevation. However, when a new invasive species appears, it may be able to thrive under a variety of conditions. Those invasive species may also lack a predator to keep its population in check. Invasive species can be intentionally or unintentionally brought to a new location. By intentional, we mean these species were purposefully introduced by either agencies or individuals. Some plants were brought in as ornamentals because they were popular in their native country. Also, people dump aquariums when they are no longer wanted or they're unable to care for them. In this picture, you can see these bright orange spots. These spots are goldfish that have survived and overwintered in this small little pond. In addition to people dumping aquariums, how many of you remember your high school or public school science classroom? Sometimes teachers would have their own aquarium with either crayfish, fish, or even just plants, and they would use that as a learning experience so students can see the impact of light or temperature on how an organism behaves. Because nobody wanted to kill the classroom pet, oftentimes that aquarium was also released into the wild. Also, plants and shrubs like Russian olive, honeysuckle were introduced for reasons such as improving bird habitat because they were considered pretty ornamental shrubs, or they were used as a windbreak to reduce soil erosion. Invasive species can also accidentally appear. Sometimes if you have construction equipment and you're moving it from one site to another without cleaning it or brushing it, it can drop off seeds and sticks that house animals, and they may become a problem in the new area. Recreation is also another source where people will take a boat or a kayak that has hanging vegetation and go from one spot to another. Interestingly enough, some aquatic plants can survive being out of water for a couple days at a time, especially in dark and humid environments. Anglers can also transport things like snails and plants if they don't clean off their waders. People who visit parks and go for walks can also transport seeds to new areas. Pets are a hidden cause because people don't really consider what pets do when they go to parks. For example, my dog would quite often disappear underneath a hedge or behind some bushes and emerge completely covered in burrs and other seeds. After coming home, instead of wanting to go inside as he was told, he liked to run around the backyard, therefore dropping some of those seeds into the backyard. Who knows what kind of infestation resulted from those activities. Now that we know how invasive species move from one area to another, let's talk about some of the environmental impacts of invasives. Species such as Oriental bittersweet, garlic mustard, and purple loosestrife can start growing earlier than native species. Therefore, their leaves will grow quicker and prevent sunlight from reaching the ground or other trees or other plants. Some plants can secrete chemicals that prevent other plants from growing nearby. It's called allelopathy. Trees can also be killed by plants growing on them. Shrubby vines, such as Oriental bittersweet, as it grows, it can wrap around the tree and it cuts into the outer bark layer. The outer bark is where nutrient transportation occurs, and if completely severed, can result in tree death. This is called girdling. Invasive species can also be very aggressive. They can be aggressive towards other species as well as to humans. In this slide, we see two examples of how invasive species outcompete native species. In the top, you see purple loosestrife has completely dominated the landscape by a river. And below, you can see garlic mustard has taken over my friend's backyard. Keep in mind that garlic mustard is one that has allelopathy and it has chemicals that can prevent plants from growing nearby. Some plants can mimic native plants with disastrous results, as with the case of swallowwort. Swallowwort is a plant that's related to milkweed. And milkweed is important because monarchs lay their eggs on the milkweed plants. And when the larvae hatch, the larvae will eat the leaves. However, swallowwort is toxic, and research has shown that when the larvae hatch on swallowwort and they eat it, they do not survive. In addition to being toxic for butterflies, they can also be toxic for deer and other livestock. Changes to the landscape can also occur. Changes such as erosion due to red swamp crayfish building a lot of burrows and destabilizing riverbanks. If a plant takes over an entire area, it can eliminate critical food sources for other organisms. Oak wilt is a disease that comes in and it can destroy and kill an entire oak stand. Also, some aquatic plants such as parrot feather, in the bottom right picture, they can grow about 1 meter above water. And if they form large mats or large clusters, they can prevent water from flowing and also cause stagnation. In addition to environmental reasons, there are economic ones as well. Japanese knotweed is a plant that can exploit the holes and cracks in the foundation of your house, your business, parking lots, and if it is severe enough to require they be replaced, that can be quite expensive. They can also impact tourism. If you're a birder whose bird that you're interested in viewing is no longer breeding in that area, you may decide to take your tourism dollars elsewhere. Invasive species can also result in poor hunting and fishing conditions. If you have a waterfront property, studies have shown that invasive Phragmites and cattails can reduce your property value, especially if it blocks the view of the water or changes the wetland or the lake, preventing you from enjoying it, swimming in it. Most importantly, your time and money. It takes a lot of time and effort in clearing out, picking invasive species from your yard. That bag that you see on the right side of the screen, that's a solid 2.5 hours of 2 adults continuously picking garlic mustard on a Saturday afternoon. Speaking of hunting and fishing, have you ever had to hike through a park trying to find your hunting spot and had Japanese barberry thorns scrape your legs and your arms? Those can be quite painful. In the bottom picture, you have Japanese knotweed, and you can see how it has expanded and taken over this person's yard. Harm to human health is also a very big concern when it comes to managing for invasive species. They can reduce visibility along roads and lakes, such that when you're trying to take a turn, you can't see oncoming traffic. They can also result in physical injury, especially if you step on shells, brush up against a plant like giant hogweed, which can give you rashes and burns. It can cause flooding in areas, fire hazards by having a lot of dry vegetation. It can also make things very dangerous if you're trying to swim or navigate water bodies and there are lots of plants around that you could get entangled in. The JLW SISMA region has a variety of invasive species already present. 5 species on our radar right now include the red swamp crayfish, which is the top left picture, Japanese stiltgrass, middle top row, Japanese knotweed in top row on the right, and then on the bottom of the screen you have parrot feather, which is on the left side, and then finally we have European frogbit on the bottom right. By now, you're probably frustrated with hearing about all these negative things that invasive species bring to our region. However, we also have species that are invasive in other parts of the world. For example, the American gray squirrel threatens the native red squirrel in the United Kingdom. The American bullfrog is a pest in countries such as France, Brazil, China, and even within USA in the western part. New England's American lobster appeared in Europe in 1999, and they have some diseases that can kill the native European lobsters or cause deformations to the shells, which reduces their market value. In 1946, Argentina relocated 20 Canadian beavers to Tierra del Fuego in the windswept archipelago of South America's tip. They really wanted to foster a strong fur trade, but unfortunately the pelt industry never took off, and the beavers didn't have any predators like wolves and bears that could keep their population in check. And since then, their populations number about 200,000. Red swamp crayfish was intentionally released in eastern Africa in man-made wetlands. They were intended to control snails. However, the plan went awry when some of these red swamp crayfish escaped to natural areas. Also, not pictured on this slide, but largemouth bass have invaded freshwater ecosystems around the world. Although it's a feisty fish that makes for good sport, they have decimated native ecosystems and impacted native fish species. You can't talk about invasive species without showing this invasion curve. This invasion curve shows that eradication of an invasive species becomes less likely and the control costs increase as an invasive species spreads over time. Prevention is the most cost-effective solution, followed by eradication. If a species is not detected and removed early, intense and long-term control efforts will be unavoidable. Unfortunately, as you can see, public awareness begins right when eradication is unlikely. If you are interested in learning more about invasive species or learning about what species are of concern in your area, feel free to contact your local SISMA. SISMAs are groups of nonprofit organizations, government agencies, businesses, or volunteer groups that have come together to address the issue of invasive species. All SISMAs operate independently and have unique projects related to what their region is facing. You can find out which SISMA covers your county by looking at the map below. SISMAs can help you with preventing, identifying, reporting, and managing invasive species. Michigan has a lot of beautiful places worth protecting. Some of those places do have varying degrees of invasive species present. However, with vigilance and care, we can prevent full infestations from happening. Not only should we be worried about our local resources, but we should consider how our actions may impact other parks and beaches. In 2019, the National Park Service reported that they had over 300 million recreation visits. That adds up to a lot of people visiting parks, visitors that are both local and from other countries. For example, in Glacier Park, at least 127 non-native species of plants have either invaded or been deliberately introduced into the park. spotted knapweed, and oxeye daisies have invaded disturbed areas throughout the park. Exotic grasses were introduced intentionally for forest grazing, and unauthorized grazing of other livestock within the park has spread non-native weeds to other areas. Globally, 42% of threatened or endangered species are at risk of invasive species. A study published in 2005 found that in the United States alone, invasive species cost more than $120 billion in damages every year. With our world becoming smaller and more accessible, the chance of new invasive species coming increases. Changes caused by climate change may allow invasive species to expand their range and persist under conditions native species cannot. If we do not take precautions right now, these invasive species threaten to destroy the very places that form our cultural identity, that impact our economy, and will change our landscape forever. However, there is hope. By learning about invasive species and sharing your knowledge with others, being aware of your surroundings, and knowing who to contact if you see something new, all help. Best practices such as cleaning your gear and burning firewood where you bought it will also help prevent the spread of invasive species. And we have had many success stories of insects, aquatic invasive plants being eradicated. This shows the importance of how much your efforts matter. Now that you know about invasive species, will you do your part? Will you help prevent the spread of invasive species?